So sorry for the disjointed nature of this series, as obviously it's not our ideal that we start a series, interrupt it a week later, and then come back to it, but I'm trusting that you, like many of us, found last week well worth the interruption. Stan was well received, and rightly so. It was remarkable stuff, and what happened there was road conditions required us to kind of shift stuff around. But here's where, as we jump back into this kind of listening therapy, and if you weren't here a couple weeks ago and you're like, what the heck was that? That's kind of the point, but maybe it'll make sense here in a couple weeks. I think one way to get your brain kind of in the groove, or even not just your brain, but your guts, would be to say, like when life happens for you, and sometimes when we say that, it just instantly implies the negative, but maybe we could even just start by the positive. Like when life happens, when a relationship's going well, when there's a promotion, when somebody accomplishes something noteworthy, when someone makes a good decision, when someone's pregnant or someone said yes, just those moments. When life happens in those ways, who do you call? Who do you send a text to? Who do you reach out to? Who do you Snapchat? Well, you Snapchat the whole world. That's probably not a good example, but like who do you reach out to? And really my interest there isn't so much who they are, but if I can get you this morning thinking about why them, then I think there's some work that we can do this morning, or at least I can maybe try to convey some stuff. Or another way to think of it is, I was thinking about that this week right before we moved here. I was in my late 20s, and there was some kind of tumultuous stuff that happened in life, and without even thinking about it, I drove to my grandpa and grandma's house. And my grandpa at the time was battling cancer and not all that well, but well enough. And I can still picture it, like them in their lazy boy chairs, me where I was seated, me kind of, and I was crying through some of it, just kind of talking through some stuff with them. But it never occurred to me until this week that it was the most natural thing ever to just drive to their house. And I think the question that I want to ask this morning and get you thinking about is why them? And when you think about some of your strategic conversations, some of those moments for you where life turned, I'm sure there were moments where there was good stuff and bad stuff, but when you think of maybe even a season of conversations that occurred, I'm not really interested in what you talked about, but why them? And what was it about them that caused you to go there? Because here's really the question that I want to ask this morning, and that's this, that in our pursuit of relationships, what if we're not always after advice? And what if we're not always after someone to fix us or solve our problems? Like, what if there's a third thing? And no one's suggesting that advice isn't a good thing. No one's suggesting that at times we don't need fixed. But what if there's this third thing? Like, in our pursuit of relationship, what if we're not always after, or maybe we even dare say often after, advice or someone to overtly fix us? What if there's this desire for something else? And one of the concessions that I think for me has been really helpful to make, and maybe this is helpful to you, because like anything, we can take stuff to the extreme. Like, especially if you've grown up in or been a part of recently, like Western evangelical culture, like one of the things that you're really good at, and this is what I've had to kind of reconcile, is since I was 17 years old and been a part of evangelical culture, wasn't raised in it, but certainly have been a part of it since I was 17 and especially 19 years old. Like, I've really, really valued the value that evangelicalism places on the didactic, on learning, on books and the Bible and sermons, on the need for information and the general belief that new information will change my life. Love that. It's part of why I do what I do. And then there's a second piece, and we've worked really hard on that around here for the last 10 years to, in some ways, kind of intentionally separate ourselves from some of the other forms of counseling and to go, no, there's a great value in expert counseling, whether it's Christian counseling or psychotherapy or psychiatry or whatever that is. We've worked hard to go, maybe some of us practice that too quickly, but others who are trained in it, that's a big piece of what it means to grow and get well. And there are times in our life where we need somebody who understands the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or some of these other different things. They can speak into our emotional life and say, hey, here's what you need to know. So here's what I want to ask this morning is, if we allow that those two things are giant pieces of the how do I get healthier puzzle, would it create the space to not be so threatened by the suggestion that there's still a third piece? And that this third piece doesn't have to do with being fixed, at least directly, and it doesn't have to do with advice. It has to do with something else entirely. It's that something else that I want to explore a little bit this morning. There's a story in the Old Testament that has been rattling around in my head for a couple months because I think it embodies what we're going to explore this morning. It's the story of Samuel and Eli. And some of you may know the story of Samuel and Eli, maybe others not so much. But Samuel, if you're looking for a place to, we can go to that next slide. If you're looking for a place to read the Bible again, read it for the first time, you could really do no worse than the book of 1 Samuel, because Samuel's such a likable character. But we're going to pick up in his story at this point where Samuel was more or less dropped off at the temple. And at this point, we're pre the sophistication of David and Solomon. Like, think of colonial America. Like, they're not in Egypt anymore. They're not wandering the desert. They're in the promised land, but it's a very tribal kind of experience. And Samuel's dropped off at the temple to be an apprentice under Eli, who's the head priest. And one night, they're both sleeping. Eli's in his room. Samuel's in the temple, which I think must be, I haven't studied this yet, but I'm guessing that's the narrator telling us and foreshadowing something about Samuel, like this guy sleeps in God's house. And in the middle of the night, Samuel hears a voice, and the voice says his name. And Samuel does what any rational person I think would do. He runs into Eli's room and assumes that Eli, this master of sorts, has called him. And Eli's doing this like, no, and I'm over 40. I only get to fall asleep once a night. I'm toast now. Go back to bed. And so Samuel goes back to bed. And then there's a second time. And again, Samuel hears this voice, Samuel. And again, he runs into Eli's room, but this time Eli's reading a book because he can't sleep anymore. That his chance has been lost. And again, Eli is like, no, it wasn't me. And a third time, so he says, go back to bed. So Samuel goes back to bed. And a third time he hears this voice. And this time Samuel gets into Eli's bedroom. And Eli says, oh, wait a minute. I think I know what's going on here. I think God is speaking to you. So here's what you need to do. Go back to your space. And if you hear the voice again, just say, what is it, Lord? Your servant is waiting. Now, there's some weird stuff there, and maybe it helps if we name it, like not the least of which hearing audible voices from God. I myself have never heard one. I don't expect to hear one, but I do think it's important that we challenge ourselves to think about whether or not our worldview allows that would be possible. And I think part of what we have to just acknowledge this morning is that the line between a genuine experience and human self-delusion, it's not like this, it's like this. It's razor thin. But if we allow that, I wonder if it gives us permission to ask this question. Would we do well if we had more friends like Eli in our lives? More friends who don't tell us what God is doing, who don't give us the answers, but who simply note the biblical basic belief, and that is this God is present, and our job is awareness. Would we do well to have more friends who go, boy, I don't know, that's a good question. Would we do well to have more friends who go, boy, it seems to me that you're becoming aware of God in your life. Maybe you need to go back to that space. It's almost like you picture it like a cartoon, right? Where Eli is just kind of pushing Samuel back to the place where he experienced God and saying, you got to work on that. Would we do well? And again, I'm not saying there's no room for teaching, and I'm not saying there's no room for counseling, but would we do well to acknowledge that central to, dare I call it, Jesus theology is this belief that says there's an invisible Spirit of God who is also capable of attending to us and pointing stuff out to us, that God is not entirely dependent upon people, though he often uses them. That there's a precedent that God can use a donkey if he has to. And would we do well to recognize that we do well when we have friends who push us back into that space, who even create that space? See, that all is alluding to this more formal thing called spiritual direction. And unless we be distracted by it, let me just speak to what spiritual direction is for a moment. Spiritual direction is a practice that's as ancient as Jesus' life itself. If it's foreign to you, that's because, like me, you come from a Western evangelical tradition, and quite frankly, spiritual direction was one of the traditions that was left along the side of the road. We value telling people stuff, and I'm not saying that's not valuable, but spiritual direction, especially among like Eastern Orthodoxy and more liturgical traditions of faith, it's a practice by which a director hosts a directee in a space. And here's the practice, especially if practice, I mean, of course, all this stuff happens on a continuum, but the contemplative version of this is the value is this: I'm going to host you in a space where you talk out loud, where you take stuff that's been rattling around in your head and you say it. And in the process of sharing that space, my listening, my asking reflective questions, my using your language, that's a big piece of this. You don't get to impose your language, you use their language. In the process of hosting you in that space, you will experience much like Samuel, God's presence in your life. And I know that's mystical and weird. And it is kind of mystical and weird. In fact, many spiritual directors will light a candle. And the significance of the candle is to signify, especially for the director, whose job is at best to talk for probably 10 minutes in an hour-long session. The candle reminds the director that the real director is the Holy Spirit, that their job is what people call listening in stereo, to attend to God and to attend to the other. It's not about mutuality. This has been one of the things that's been a really hard learning curve for me because I'm self-absorbed and because so much of life, the way we build relationships is we build mutuality. Oh, your dog died? My dog died once, and so let me tell you the story. And in doing, we think what we're doing is giving advice, or we think what we're doing is relating back. But the more you see this and the more you catch yourself respond to someone else's self-disclosure with your own bit of self-disclosure, the more you see they leave the heart feeling place and you push them back into the head place. That's why directors, as a value, see their own directors, because when something stirs in them, their job is to let it go and just stay with the person. That's spiritual direction. Now, my interest here isn't to necessarily sell you on going to see a spiritual director. The irony is there really aren't any in Helena, and one of my ambitions for us as a church together is I would love it if 10 years from now we've influenced the training of said spiritual directors so that it's as normal in Helena as our psychiatrists and therapists and other things of that nature and good churches, quite frankly. Part of what stands out to me, maybe this is academic, is that in metropolitan kind of areas and urban areas, spiritual direction is huge, especially for our kids, for the uns and the nuns and the de-churched people, because it's providing safe place to work through, much like chaplaincy does in other contexts, safe place to work out God's presence in a person's life. My interest here is to go, what does it look like as people when we first of all hold in tension a God who shows up in our listening with a God who shows up in our answers? And what does it look like in our interpersonal style to become a little bit more self-aware of knowing when to push what button? And for what it's worth, I'm horrible at this, and to whatever degree that's helpful, I'm hoping that's what actually credits me, because I have to work as hard at this or harder than anybody. You know, one of the images used for spiritual direction is, and this is somewhat ironic because I'm a male, is that of being a midwife or a labor and delivery nurse. And you read this often in spiritual direction literature. Why? Because what they observe is oftentimes in life, there's something you have to work through and out. Oftentimes in your experience with the holy, there's something that you've got to do the work, and no one can do it for you. And that's why, if we're not careful, our intervention techniques attempt to do it for you. But that doesn't change the fact that it still is wise for you to have someone in that space with you, who's maybe been there, done that, who's seen this process before, who understands how it goes and can encourage you forward. Not do the work for you, but encourage you forward. It's why I'll bet you if you go back to who you're going to call, other than the Ghostbusters, I'll bet it's somebody that as you tell them how excited you are about this thing you're going to buy, or how excited you are about the school you're going to attend, or whatever it is, I'll bet it's somebody who has this remarkable ability, and we're going to talk more about this next week, to suspend judgment and just listen. Who knows that in this instance, you're not asking for advice. You're just asking to share it with somebody. You know, Lacey Bourgo, one of my instructors in this, and quite an authority on this field, she says it this way. She says, she's constantly saying this, go to that next slide, that we have to allow people to open their own gifts. And again, I'm not saying this is the only way we learn or the only way we experience God. I'm just asking us to hold in tension that along with these things that we're familiar with, there's this other thing. And what she means by that is the goal of listening is not the aha. It's not for you to listen to them enough to go, I tell you what you need to see here. It's actually to reserve the right to even see that. In fact, the experts, they learn to not even go there mentally. Go ahead to that next slide. Lacey said it this way in a lecture, and then I'll unpack a little bit more. She said, when you become focused on a desired outcome for another, you've shifted from listening to fixing. Now, again, she's not saying fixing's wrong, but her point is that for her red flag is, if in listening to you, if suddenly I'm preoccupied, and I'm guessing we can all relate, if suddenly I'm preoccupied with, well, I tell you what you need to do. I tell you what the answer to this problem is. She would say, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but the moment you've done that, you've stepped away from a listening-centric model into an interventionist, fixing-centered model. What if God works in the silence? There's Lynn Holt, who will be here in a couple weeks to actually cap this series off, who's an expert in this and an instructor at Fox as well. She says it this way. She says, that of God in me sees that of God in you. It's the campfire picture. And in fact, another familiar picture for spiritual directors is of the old cowboy in the Old West, sitting around a fire, and we can all kind of appreciate, if nothing else from cinema, how the proverbial people who wander into the camp, sit around the campfire, spit in the spittoon, drink the whiskey, tell their stories, and get up and leave. And it's this observation that something unique happens around a campfire. In fact, you're probably like my family, where you're just looking forward to getting your fire pit going again, because there's something different that happens around a campfire or a fire pit. It's not a space of advice and fixing. It's just this space where we stare into a flame, and it's just safe to talk. It's one of the pictures here. And Lacey's point from her quote is that spiritual direction operates on the assumption that God was present in this person's life before we had this exchange, and God will be present after this person leaves, and therefore the urgency's not all on me. In my training right now, I have to do some direction, which is really fun to be a part of a practical training. And after the first time, I remember my wife and I were going to dinner afterwards, and she said, what was that like? And I hadn't even thought of this before, which is kind of a case in point. And I said, I tell you, what's super refreshing is to listen to someone talk about their experience of God and feel no obligation or permission to filter it for theological correctness. Now, again, I'm not saying there's not a right and a wrong way to relate to God. What I am saying is that the value here is this belief that God is working. If this person wants to talk to you about their spiritual life, this God is at work in their life, and you don't have to own every detail of that. You just host that space. There's a verse in the Psalms that's probably familiar to you if you've been around church before. Be still and know that I'm God. This has exposed something for me, because I operate on the assumption that text is about the quiet time. It's about a journal and a Bible and an office by yourself. Those of you introverted people especially, those of you who connect with God by getting alone, that's the verse, right? Here's what's ironic about that is the Psalms are like communal worship songs. At best, we're taking a principle and applying it in a different culture. What if being still and knowing that I'm God, knowing that God is God, certainly not me, what if that happens when a person attends to another and just listens? What if that happens in extended relationship where you develop the pattern of, I'm just going to listen, I'm going to help you process, and as time unfolds, I'm going to watch as God avails himself to you. You know, there's this thing that I do, and it's just starting to get exposed in me in these last, I guess, year or so that I've been in this training, but it's really kind of come to a head more recently. Like I've been working in church since I was 20 years old. When I was in student ministry, the Win was all about what we called contact work. It was all about the one-on-one. It was all about spending time with people. Now in Helena, of course, as a staff, it's one of our high values. We do lunches and coffees every day. So there's this thing that has happened to me more times than I can count, probably with some of you, many of you, and I've been in the other shoe as well, but I'll get this email that says, hey, I've got some questions, or we'll have an exchange on Sunday or at Costco or whatever. Hey, I've got some questions, and I'll say, great, let's get together. Because quite frankly, we can all relate to this. There's nothing more flattering than someone saying, you know something, and I would love to learn that from you. It's like, whether it's photography or teaching or raising kids, whatever it is, like that's the best, right? But here's the mistake that I'm realizing that I all too often make, is eventually we end up somewhere, generally eating or drinking something, having this conversation. And that person, maybe it's been you, will start the conversation by saying, okay, so I got these questions. And pretty soon these questions rattle into a 5-minute monologue and then a 10-minute monologue. And at about 20 minutes in, you talking, I'm listening, my brain is ready to explode Because there's this frustrating thing happening going like, wait a minute, you said you wanted to hear my advice, and let me tell you, I would love to pontificate upon the literal nature of Adam and Eve. Like, let's go, I'm ready for this. And what I do, the mistake I've learned that I make is eventually, because I'm type A enough and all that socially capable, eventually I'll just elbow my way into the conversation and give you my great answers to your questions. I'm learning to watch as your affect completely changes when I do that. Because there's this realization of, and this is what I'm learning, you didn't call me there because you need me to answer your questions. Now, are there cases of that? Of course there are. But more than that, you needed a space to say some things out loud. And frankly, it wasn't enough just to say it to your journal. You needed to say it to someone. And in the process of your saying it to someone, God continues to show up and help you work through that very process. What happens if, as Western, rational, post-Enlightenment people, we recognize that there is a value to just being listened to? You know, there's a story in the Gospels that you'll have to decide whether or not I'm stretching it too much, but quite frankly, I've been circling around this for months as well, because it seems to me that Luke may be observing this very thing, but of course we don't know that. It's a story about it. I'm just going to start reading it. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. So now, placing yourself northern shore of Sea of Galilee, one of the more prominent cities relative to that area. When a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. Now remember, centurion, of course, is a Roman military officer, and this is hard for us to get our brains around, but I think it's important that we remember that Jesus lived in a land that was occupied by a foreign military. Like the equivalent of, there were soldiers with AR-15s on every corner who could basically do anything they wanted, who raped your women and took advantage of your financial systems and basically answered to no one and mostly didn't like you and represented a culture that couldn't have been more different from your own. He also has a servant. Now, we don't know for sure, but we do know that centurions weren't allowed to marry in the land that they served until they retired, and there's some speculation that this servant was actually a significant other, maybe even a Jewish lover, if you will. And this guy cares about them. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. So he sent some people to Jesus to solve his problem. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So this guy's sympathetic, at least this guy is sympathetic to the Jewish thought process about God. So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to him to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof." This, of course, refers to just being defiled religiously. It's like, oh, geez, I invited people over and the house is a disaster. It's that kind of thing, only it's deeper than that. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. So he's acknowledging something pretty major about Jesus, right? That he has the ability to make things happen without having to be there presently. Jesus responds, the narrator says Jesus responded, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I've not found such great faith even in Israel. Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Here's what stands out to me. Was there a problem? Yeah, there was a problem. Was there a solution to the problem? Yeah, I mean, again, it pushes our boundaries for the way we see the world, but there was a solution to the problem. Was the problem solved? There was. Did Jesus solve the problem by what he said? The remarkable thing about Luke's version of the story is Jesus said nothing. There were no words in play here. And again, all I can do is speculate. So don't write your theological dissertation on this one. But what stands out to me is we have a centurion saying stuff out loud. I have a friend who's just always saying, like, stuff gets more real when it just leaves your mouth. We have a centurion saying stuff out loud about God. And then we have somebody just taking it, not judging it, not correcting it, but just stepping forward. And then we have a guy saying more out loud about God. And then we have Jesus issuing no judgment of it, just stepping forward. I think one of the questions Luke begs us to consider was the centurion's big aha. Wait a minute, I know how authority works. You could do this. Was his big aha something he had in his back pocket before this exchange started? Or was the aha, this spiritual moment where God revealed something to him, the very result of a space where he got to speak and someone else listened, and it was safe to not get it perfectly right? What if, in our account of a spiritual world and growth and all those things, what if we took this whole listening thing more seriously? Not just from the formal sense, but just in everyday interaction. And maybe this is because, I'm the most socially inept person there is. I had this experience just last week where Stan came to town, and Stan Simmons, 75 years old, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more accomplished pastor in the whole Pacific Northwest. So I'm walking to have dinner with him, thinking John Maxwell to myself, like when in the audience of people smarter than you, shut your mouth and ask questions. So I'm trying to kind of sum up all this stuff inside of me that I can kind of give him into this perfectly presented question, which will allow him to wax eloquent. We sit down, and we had a fine dinner. It's such a privilege to sit in front of him. But we did that kind of clunky thing where, in hindsight, there was stuff he wanted to share and there was stuff I wanted to share, but we were both kind of trying not to talk too much and ask our questions. And frankly, I can't help but wonder, what if I'd have just named it? What if I'd have said, hey, why don't you just talk for 20 minutes about what it is you're excited about? Just tell me what's going on. And then maybe when you're done with that, I could ask you some questions and restate some things and just kind of have the conversation. And I get it would be a little mechanical, but for me that would be helpful. And then what if rather than having the pressure to formulate, it's been 2 years since I've seen Stan. We've been through a ton together as a church. He's been a vital coach of this place from very early on. What if then rather than having the pressure to formulate all of that into the perfect question that allows him to then respond, what if I'd have just given myself the permission to go could I just talk at you for 20 minutes? Because I'm really dying to have your feedback and hear your questions, but I don't know how to make it cute and nice. Could I just talk at you? And then just invite you to please say things back? Listen, it's not lost on me that we could take this to the extreme. I'm surrounded, I feel like right now. And when I say surrounded, I mean 3, but I feel like every time I turn around, I'm surrounded by someone who's doing a cleanse right now, which I'm glad it's them, not me, right? But here's my understanding of what they're doing, and I think it's respect-worthy, especially as a friend explained it to me on Friday, that really the goal is to get radically more healthy in the hopes that when you return to center, you bring some of that with you. And I wonder if that's the way this listening thing might work. Maybe we've got to take it to the extreme. Maybe we've got to walk into meetings and interactions or even call meetings with this conviction that I'm just going to listen. Maybe we've got to look for those key moments where we just sense God going no, just shut up. Maybe taking it to that extreme will make us, and this is what I'm experiencing a little bit, is it'll make us that much more aware of when in the moment to go, wait a minute, she's not asking for me to relate back. I had, my instructor is constantly saying, this space, Adam, it's just for them. I had an experience recently where we practiced this real time. It was kind of this strange thing, but super helpful, but for an introvert, it's hell. Where in class in Portland, she'll put us in groups of 3, there's 5 of us in a group, and so everybody has a role to play, but 2 people, one person directs, one's the directee, and then the instructor sits there and watches, as long with everybody else. And I did this session with this individual. I want to be careful with confidentiality, but it was a woman whose husband's a pretty big deal. And she was talking through some real personal kind of parenting stuff, and along the way, she alluded to some marriage stuff within there. And at the very end of the session, I said, can I pray for you? Which is, you got to land the airplane somehow. And she said, sure. And I said, so what's your husband's name? And she told me her husband's name. And, I'm patting myself on the back because I'm a product of Fred who always focuses on marriage and the spouse. And I get done praying and we do this evaluation thing and there's all this back and forth that happens. You're so exposed and yet it's so helpful. And at the very end, Lacey, my instructor, she leaned into me pretty heavy and she said, so why did you ask her husband's name? I said, because I wanted to pray for them. And she said, she never gave you her husband's name. And then she said, and while we're at it, when you prayed, you said her name first. Or his name, excuse me, I just blew that. When you prayed, you said his name before her name. And then she kind of leaned in and she said, Adam, let me just give you a little bit of her perspective of a woman from a prominent man's life. Everything is about him. And this space was hers, and you just took that from her. What happens if we develop that skill in our interactions, where we understand sometimes people don't care about your stories, and when you tell them, you just take the bottom out of the experience. Sometimes he just wants to be heard. She just wants to be heard. And what if the discipline within that is to apply what we claim to believe about a triune God who has a spirit, who can show up and does not limit himself to your words as a historic student of God? So here's my prayer for you, and we're going to pick this up again next week. What would happen if you were just to say some prayer to God that was something along the lines of, okay, Lord, I have no doubt that I'm inept as a listener, because I think we are culturally. I would love it if you would break into my life this week and point out different situations, different opportunities. And what would happen if you were to end your day by just taking a few minutes of reflection and going, okay, Lord, when did I talk when I was supposed to listen? When did I fail to give the value of space? And maybe even go to the next step and go, okay, so where's the space where I just get to blab without judgment, but under the anticipation of a God who shows up? So we're going to end with a song as well as a poem, this poem written by a spiritual director. So Anna's going to come on up here. I've asked Anna to read this, and then the band's going to come on up here. I think the poem is called How to Listen. Is that right? And it's on the mind map should you decide that you want it.
How to listen. When the old God has left the building, leaving me, sitting there, feeling lonely, and I can't recapture the feeling of being your one and only. Your one and only. It's like someone you care for has gone and died, and deep down you know that it won't be the same. You hope someday you'll see them on the other side, but when it happens, you might not even know their name. No, it won't ever be the same. I don't need someone to answer all my questions. I don't need you to fix me. I need someone who knows how to listen. I just need you to walk with me. Just walk with me for a while. When the old way of being is no longer working, and the old way of seeing leaves me blind, all the things I thought that I knew, they still won't see me through. And I don't know if I'll find it. I'm lost, and I don't know. I don't need someone to answer all my questions. Somewhere along the way, I've lost some pieces. I'm digging around in my old neighborhood. After all that I've done and all that's been done to me, I need someone to tell me I'm still good. Underneath it all, I'm good. I don't need someone to answer all my questions. A poem by Jeff Drury.
In a moment, our ushers are going to come forward with the offering. So if you take ownership in giving, you can go ahead and prepare for that now. If not, or you're guests with us, you can just let those buckets go right on by you. And to be around here at Narrate, you're going to hear us use this phrase, gather and scatter, quite a bit. And so we gather here on Sunday mornings at Grand Street, and we work really hard to wrestle with topics that are relevant to you and your everyday lives. And then the rest of the week, we like to scatter. We like to get out into our community and serve people where they're at. So we've got quite a few scattering events coming up, or a few for our Easter weekend, and I'm going to talk about the Mount Helena Run for Justice. So this is the third year we've done the Mount Helena Run, but this is the first year we're partnering with a nonprofit called Love Justice. They work in, I want to say, like 20 countries around the world fighting human trafficking. And it's really interesting. They set up these interception stations along international borders and intercept people as they're being trafficked. And then they work with the police to help prosecute traffickers and then get the victims home safely, if home is a safe place, or provide a safe location for them. So they do some really phenomenal work. And one thing that I think is really cool is the founder of Love Justice International is actually from Helena. He graduated from Capitol High, and so he lives in Nepal now, but I also think it's a really cool local connection as well. So our Mount Helena Run for Justice is going to be Saturday. Okay, I just had to take a deep breath. I was talking too fast. Our Mount Helena Run for Justice is going to be Saturday, April 20th. If you would like to run, you can go to our website, narratechurch.org, or find us on Facebook, and there will be a link to the sign-up registration. And so if you register before or on April 1st, it's a little bit cheaper, and you also are guaranteed your correct shirt size. You can still register after, but the price goes up about $10. And also, because I've had this question quite a few times, if you're not interested in running or walking, or you won't be around Easter weekend, but would still like to donate, if you just go to that website and click on the link to register, there's a little donate tab, and you can click donate, and then you can donate any amount you'd like. So I've had that question quite a few times, just to get that out there, and then all of those proceeds are going to go back to Love Justice as well. So if you'd like to get involved in helping out on the race day, we still have about 30 more slots open to volunteer. Those include setup, check-in, and registration. And then we have a few spots for course guards along the route. So you're stationed along the route, guiding and cheering on people that are running and walking. And then we have a few more spots left for teardown as well. So if you're interested in helping out, there's some sign-up sheets in the back in the lobby. And I'll be in the lobby after the gathering too, and I'd love to chat with you and answer any questions you might have.